Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome a lady that's going to talk to us about possible solutions, and her name is Sarah Mook. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Mavis. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen. So following on from the conversation that we were having earlier with Sarah Stout in America, Dawn asked whether I could talk a little bit about possible solutions to racial harmony. And so the first thing that I came up with was a little list of possible solutions, which I want to run through in about 10 minutes. And the first possible solution is about thinking about our communication. The second one is about the lens through which we look when we're having difficult conversations about racism. The third point is about history, what has happened, and not brushing that under the carpet. The next point is about how we create brave spaces for having conversations that matter, conversations that can bring change. The fifth point is that I have a deep belief, it sounds maybe a bit odd, but I think we should turn the policing in this country and in America over to the grandmothers. And then the last point is about resources. So as quickly as I can, just to say that when we're communicating about race and race issues, the first thing, the first place to go is empathy. So after George Floyd was killed, I was reaching out to some of my Black friends, and I noticed inside myself this real desire to talk about the white policeman who had taken the knee and who had stood alongside in solidarity. And I realized that that was completely the wrong place to go, because that's not the important thing here. The important thing here is that yet again, after a long history of struggle, somebody else has been killed. And the place to go is the place of empathy. And that's not easy, to actually sit in the grief and come alongside in the despair. But that's what brings connection. And so the first thing about trying to reach across any racial divide is empathy first. Empathy first. The next point is that some of the communication kind of techniques that are around at the moment talk about what motivates human behaviour. So we all have judgments. We're all taught to have judgments. We're all taught when we're growing up that some things that we do are good and that other things that we do are bad. That some people are right and other people are wrong. That we should do this or we should do that. And we're taught to think about life in those ways. Judgments are the ways that we're taught to think. And non-violent communication, which is one of the the things that I base a lot of my work around, is that every human behaviour, whether it's tragically useless or whether it's important and good, is actually an attempt to meet a need, an attempt to meet a need. But this is in the context that we also have systems that perpetuate poverty and brutality. And many people experience this throughout life, systems that continue to perpetuate messages that one group can survive only at the expense of another. So in that context, it's really difficult sometimes to think about all behaviour as meeting a human need. And one of the women that I've been working with recently is an African-American woman in the US called Roxy Manning. And she says when she comes to look at all behaviour being around meeting a human need, she says Martin Luther King called us to step out of the false safety of judgment and distance, to step into a world where nobody is just completely evil. I worry that in saying this, some people will say this is just an excuse for inexcusable behaviour. But this act of finding compassion and learning to love our enemy, of connection with shared humanity, is not about excusing violent behaviour or allowing it to continue. So one of the basis is that we need to look at behaviour as a need. Even if that's not true, it doesn't matter, because it's a useful place to stand. And if we can understand what the need is underneath the behaviour, then we have got more of a chance of building a bridge. Hope that makes sense. That's quite complicated. But the third thing is that we need to know our history. We need to know what has happened in the past. And we may be late coming to the party with this as white people, but we do need to know what has happened. And it has been hidden from us. The way that we're taught history in school hides the truth of the horrors of colonialism and slavery, and the impact that it has had on others. And we also, as we get to know our history and the facts of our history, we also need to undo and dismantle the colonialism and the patriarchy that we find within ourselves. The next point was to hold brave spaces for conversations. So when I work with conflict, or when I work with holding space for difficult conversations, there are lots of stages that we go through. And if you're holding brave spaces for conflict or interracial issues, this is kind of the iceberg to describe how we think about what's going on underneath the surface. So above the surface is what the person says, but one layer underneath that is what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what their underlying needs may be. Underneath that are the power dynamics. So which person has structural power, which person has systemic power, which person has personal power. And then underneath that, there is often our trauma, which can be multi-generational, and it can be something which can be motivating the conversation. And then at the very bottom level, I have a trust, and that trust is that we need to be working this out together, and that there is an impulse of life which will support us to find healing and peace. So that's how I hold spaces when I work. And then my last point is to turn the policing over to the grandmothers. I actually, there's a lot more around this that I'd like to speak about, but there's something about the way that we do all the kind of racial justice in this country that is so totally wrong. So I want to just leave you with some resources. These were recommended by Sarah Stout, who did the conversation with Layla and myself earlier. And I'm just going to leave those with you. So if you are a white person who would like to understand more about racial issues, these are some resources that might help you. So there's the bottom one is Our White Friends Desiring to Be Allies. The top one, Me and White Supremacy. And then if you would like to be in touch, the lady who I quoted from in the States, who does interracial justice work, is Roxy Manning. She's an African-American woman, and she has a website which talks about nurturing the seeds of change and using nonviolent communication as a force of social cohesion. Another woman who I really rate, also in America, runs free calls on facing privilege and dismantling the patriarchy. Those, you can find her at thefearlessheart.org. And then my website is sarahmook.co.uk, and I do relational life coaching and conflict resolution. So I hope that this has just given a flavour of some of the possible solutions to racial harmony. The most important is to make sure that we listen as white people. We listen, we listen, we listen. We stop speaking and hand over the mic, making space for you. And we allow space to let our own tears flow for all the things that have gone wrong in the past. So yeah, I hand over now to you, and thank you so much for this space to have come alongside you. Thanks, Mavis.
Fashion and furnishings.